When you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. This is the golden rule of Sherlock Holmes, the most famous, rational, and ruthlessly logical detective in all of fiction. Holmes is a thinking machine. He's a master of deduction, a skeptic of all things supernatural, a man who believes only in the cold, hard, observable evidence. He is, in many ways, the high priest of scientific rationalism, and the man who created him, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, was, by all accounts, his equal. Doyle was not some dreamy poet. He was a trained physician, a man of science, a graduate of the University of Edinburgh's medical school. He was a man who, in his own life, used his Holmes-like deductive skills to solve real-life crimes, most famously the 1906 Great Wiley Outrages case, where his investigation exonerated a wrongly convicted man, George Edalji. Arthur Conan Doyle, creator of the world's greatest skeptic, was a champion of logic, evidence, and reason, which is what makes what happened next one of the most baffling, bizarre, and profoundly tragic paradoxes in modern history. What if I told you that this same man, this doctor, this champion of logic, became the world's #1 believer in fairies, and not just as a concept? He staked his global reputation, his fortune, and his legacy on a series of laughably fake photographs taken by two young girls in a garden, showing them posing with what were clearly paper cutouts. How? How could the man who invented Sherlock Holmes be fooled by a hoax that a modern child could see through in an instant? Was he a secret mystic all along? Was he a brilliant man shattered by unimaginable grief? Or was he a fool? This is the fascinating, forgotten, and deeply human story of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's battle with reality. This is the case of the Cottingley Fairies. To understand how the creator of Sherlock Holmes could come to believe in fairies, you must first understand the world that broke him. And that world was defined by one cataclysmic event, the First World War. The Great War of 1914 to 1918 was a mechanized human slaughterhouse on a scale the world had never seen. Machine guns, poison gas, artillery, an entire generation of young men was wiped out in the mud of Flanders. The death was sudden, senseless, and industrial. And this mass, industrial death created a profound spiritual crisis. The old, comfortable Victorian beliefs in God, in progress, and in a rational, orderly universe died in the trenches. For millions, traditional religion offered no comfort. A distant, heavenly afterlife felt abstract and insufficient. People were not just grieving, they were traumatized. And they were desperate, not for theological platitudes, but for contact, for proof. They wanted to know that their dead sons, brothers, and husbands were okay. Into this epidemic of grief exploded the spiritualist movement, as we've discussed in a previous video. Spiritualism, the belief that the living could communicate directly with the spirits of the dead through mediums and seances, had been a major force since the 1850s, but World War I gave it a new, desperate urgency. It was no longer a parlor game, it was an emotional necessity. And Arthur Conan Doyle was not just a casual observer. He was a devout convert. Why? Because the war was not an abstract tragedy. For him, it was deeply personal. In 1918, his beloved eldest son, Kingsley Conan Doyle, died of pneumonia contracted while recovering from wounds sustained at the Battle of the Somme. His brother, Innes Doyle, died of the same 1918 flu pandemic just months later. He also lost his brother-in-law and two of his nephews in the war. The man who had spent his life championing logic was, like millions of others, shattered by grief. The rational world had produced only a senseless meat grinder. He found solace not in science, but in the séance room. He became a full-blown, passionate, and public advocate for spiritualism, believing he had received proof of his son's survival. Spiritualism became the new lens through which he saw the entire world. His will to believe was now his dominant characteristic. And this new, grief-fueled worldview is what left him perfectly, tragically vulnerable to what came next. The story begins in 1917, in the small village of Cottingley, England. Two young cousins, Elsie Wright 16 and Francis Griffiths 9, loved to play by a small stream, or beck, behind their house. When they came home covered in mud, they claimed it was because they had been playing with the fairies. Elsie's father, an amateur photographer, was skeptical. "Prove it," he said, and lent them his camera. The girls went to the stream and returned a short time later. When their father developed the plates in his darkroom, he was stunned. The first photo showed young Frances staring into the camera, while in front of her, a group of 4 small, winged, dancing fairies frolicked on the leaves. A second photo, taken later, showed Elsie sitting on the grass, smiling, as a small, winged gnome or elf danced on her hand. The girls' parents were divided. The mother, Polly, believed. The father, Arthur, having worked with photographic plates, suspected they were fakes, but he couldn't figure out how they had done it. The photos circulated locally. In 1919, they fell into the hands of Edward Gardner, a prominent leader in the Theosophical Society, a mystical, New Age-like movement that was deeply interested in proving the existence of nature spirits, elementals, and other invisible realms. Gardner was ecstatic. This was the proof he had been looking for. He, in turn, sent the photographs to the one man he knew would take them seriously, the world's most famous spiritualist believer, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. This was the moment. This was the test. What would the creator of Sherlock Holmes, the man of medicine and logic, do when presented with this extraordinary evidence? He did not apply Holmesian logic. He did the opposite. Holmes's method: data, data, data. I can't make bricks without clay. One must not theorize before one has all the evidence. Doyle's method. Doyle had a theory first that spirits, elementals, and fairies were real. He was now just looking for data to confirm it. He set out to investigate the photos, but his investigation was a case study in confirmation bias. 1. He checked for technical fraud, but ignored the obvious. Doyle was not a complete fool. He knew about double exposures, so he sent the original glass plate negatives to photography experts at the Kodak company. The experts came back with a baffling report. The plates, they said, showed no signs of being fakes. There was no evidence of double exposure. They were single exposure photographs. One expert did note that the fairies seemed suspiciously flat and looked like they had been cut out of paper, but he couldn't prove it. For Doyle, this was the smoking gun. If it wasn't a technical fraud or double exposure, then it must be real. He had eliminated one impossible, and whatever remained. 2. He dismissed the prosaic fraud. The most obvious explanation, of course, was that the girls had faked it using simple cardboard cutouts. This is where Doyle's anti-Holmes logic truly shines. He dismissed this possibility for purely psychological reasons, he argued. The girls were simple, uneducated, country girls. They were not clever enough to pull off such a sophisticated hoax. More importantly, they were good, honest children. It was, for him, morally inconceivable that two innocent, rural children would be capable of such a cynical, sustained, and blasphemous lie. He concluded that the honesty of the girls was incontestable. This is the ultimate failure of logic. Sherlock Holmes's great strength was that he trusted no one. He was a cynic who believed everyone was capable of anything. Arthur Conan Doyle, the grieving spiritualist, was a true believer who wanted to believe in the innocence of children and the existence of a magical world. 3. He published his findings. Doyle, now utterly convinced, staked his entire global reputation on the photos. In 1920, he published the first 2 images in The Strand magazine, the very magazine that published the Holmes stories. The article, Fairies Photographed, an epic-making event, was a sensation. He later got the girls to take 3 more photos. And in 1922, he published a full-length, breathless book, The Coming of the Fairies. In it, he laid out his evidence, his takedowns of skeptics, and his grand theory that these were real nature spirits, a new order of life that was beginning to reveal itself to humanity. For the creator of Sherlock Holmes, the case was closed. The world, however, was not so sure. While many spiritualists and theosophists celebrated the proof, the general public, and especially the scientific and photographic communities, were deeply skeptical. The photos just looked fake. They looked like paper cutouts. Doyle spent the rest of his life, until his death in 1930, as a tireless missionary for spiritualism, traveling the world, giving lectures on his dead son and his fairy photographs. He died, by all accounts, as a true believer. He never wavered. And the case remained a bizarre, unsolved footnote for decades. The 2 girls, Elsie and Frances, grew up, moved away, and kept their story mostly. The photos are real, they would say, with a coy, carefully worded ambiguity. The final, undeniable truth didn't come out until 1983. Elsie and Frances, now elderly women, finally gave a full confession, published in a skeptical journal. How, after 65 years, did they do it? It was exactly as the critics had suspected. It was a hoax. Elsie, who was a talented art student, had copied the illustrations of dancing girls from a popular children's book of the time, Princess Mary's Gift Book. She added wings, and they cut out the figures from cardboard. They propped up these 3 2-4-inch high cutouts in the foliage using hatpins. Frances posed, Elsie took the picture, and they returned the camera to her father. They were just 2 young, creative girls having fun, who were, perhaps, a bit annoyed at the adults for mocking them about seeing fairies. When the photos were suddenly taken seriously by famous experts like Edward Gardner and, most terrifyingly of all, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle himself, the girls were trapped. They were too ashamed and too frightened to admit the truth to the most famous man in the world. So they kept the secret for a lifetime. The story of Doyle and the Cottingley fairies is not just a funny anecdote. It is a profound and deeply sad story. It's a story about the nature of belief, the power of grief, and the limits of human reason. It forces us to ask the question that started it all: how? How did the man who gave us the phrase, "It is a capital mistake to theorize before one has data," fall for such an obvious, dataless hoax? This is the final debate, and the historical and psychological evidence points to a few powerful, overlapping explanations. Argumenta, the broken by grief theory. This is the most common and most compassionate explanation. Doyle was not a fool. He was a broken man. The sheer, unimaginable trauma of World War I, and the personal loss of his son, brother, and so many others, simply shattered his rational mind. He was not seeking the truth. He was desperate for comfort. His belief in spiritualism wasn't an intellectual conclusion. It was an emotional shield. The fairy photographs were just one more piece of proof that the cold, materialist, scientific world that had killed his son was wrong, and that a magical, spiritual world was real. Argument B, the true believer theory. This view argues that grief wasn't a break from his character. It was a return to it. Holmes, the rationalist, was the fiction. Doyle, the mystic, was the real man. He had always been drawn to the supernatural, to chivalry, to romance. He had investigated spiritualism long before the war. The war didn't create his belief, it just supercharged it. He believed in fairies because he wanted to believe in a universe that was enchanted, magical, and meaningful, not the cold, godless clockwork of a Sherlock Holmes story. His belief wasn't a failure of logic. It was a choice of a different logic. Argument C. The intellectual arrogance theory. This is a more critical view. It suggests that Doyle's very genius was his downfall. He was the creator of Sherlock Holmes, the man who solved real crimes, a celebrated public intellectual. He became intellectually arrogant. He was so convinced of his own superior deductive powers that he believed he could not be fooled. He ran his tests checking the negatives. When they came back clean, he concluded the photos were real because his tests were infallible. He trusted his own intellect more than the blatant evidence of his own eyes. So, what is the final verdict on Sir Arthur Conan Doyle? Was he a tragic victim, a brilliant mind destroyed by a grief so profound that it short-circuited his reason? Or was he a committed mystic, a man whose will to believe in an enchanted world was simply, and always, stronger than his commitment to the cold, hard logic of his own greatest creation? Let me know your thoughts, respectfully, in the comments below. If you found this deep dive into one of history's most bizarre and fascinating psychological cases compelling, please hit the like button and subscribe for more content that uncovers the hidden stories behind our beliefs and practices. Thanks for watching.